I don't want to sound too cynical, but one of the things that the Jews are good at is complaining. And we see that in the Torah multiple times, that they complain about various things, including this week's parasha. The only thing about this week's parasha, which is interesting, and I don't think people necessarily pay attention to it, is that we're now at the next generation. We've literally gone from last week to this week, we've jumped 40 years. And we're now dealing with the people who are getting ready to go into the land of Israel. And they complain. And the Torah tells us that the nature of their complaint is that they spoke against Hashem and against Moshe. So it's normal, unfortunately, that they complain about various things that Hashem had done. Why did you take us out of Egypt? How come? Whatever, all the various things that he wants us to go into a land that's not a land that we can conquer, etc. And we've had complaints against Moshe, like the rebellion of Korach. And in this particular case, even though the Torah doesn't specify what it is that they said against Moshe specifically, but the Torah frames it as quite a direct assault on Moshe himself. Because of this event, Hashem sends snakes. Do you remember the story? There's this sudden plague of snakes that happens while the Jewish people are in the desert, and people are bitten by the snakes, and people start dying from the venom of the snakes. So everybody realizes, okay, something's happening over here, and we've done something inappropriate, and we need to reconcile. So they immediately go and they ask Moshe basically to daven on their behalf. And they're essentially asking for forgiveness. So Moshe does. Without any delay, he straight away davens to Hashem, even though this was a personal attack against him. He immediately davens to Hashem to remove the venomous snakes. So from Moshe's part, his reaction is immediate. As soon as he sees that there's some level of contrition, he says, okay, let's deal with this. Let's fix this. But Hashem's response, interestingly, is not so rapid. Hashem's response is, he tells Moshe, make for yourself a snake and put it on a tall pole, and whoever is bitten by a snake, they will come to this pole, and then they will look upwards in the direction of where the snake is, and then they'll recover, and they won't die because of the venom of the snake. Now, any person who's ever been, God forbid, in an emergency situation, you'll know that when they talk about seconds count, it's a real thing. And if somebody's got a snake bite, you really don't have a lot of time to play with. And now the camp, you know how big the camp was? It's 12 kilometers wide. So if you happen to be the person who's somewhere on the fringes, and the person gets bitten by the snake, and now they've got to get all the way to where the snake is on the staff, which we can assume was likely around where Moshe lived, just right in the center of the camp. So you could have a 5-6 kilometer walk that you've got to do in order to get to the snake. By the way, one of the things that you don't want somebody to do, God forbid if they're bitten by a snake, is you don't want them to move too much, because you want to slow their circulation, because you don't want the venom going through the whole system. Here, what are you doing? You're making a guy run for like a few kilometers to be able to get to the snake in order to be able to heal himself. So it does seem a little bit strange, right? Because if we're looking for an opportunity to help people because they've shown some level of regret over the fact that they spoke up against Hashem and against Moshe, should have made it a little bit more accessible, should have made it a little bit easier. Okay, so that's the irony of the story. Moshe is quick to respond and daven on their behalf, and yet the system that is set up in order to help the people seems like a little bit of a delaying system, or a system that's going to require a certain amount of time. Okay, so we have to examine that, and we're not going to get to that today, but it is part of what we have to examine. Instead, what we're going to start with today is what Rashi has to say about this. So Rashi tells us that Moshe, after the Jews approach him, immediately davens and asks Hashem to help them and to heal them and to remove this great danger that was threatening the entire Jewish people. So what does Rashi say we learn from that? from the fact that Moshe immediately davens on their behalf. Let's think about it for a second before we look at Rashi. What do you think the lesson could be? Everybody in this group, they've spoken against Moshe. Now the snakes come. And now they come running to Moshe to ask for forgiveness. And Moshe davens for them immediately. What do you think the lesson is?
Unconditional love.
Unconditional love. Okay? Any other thoughts? If it was unconditional love, why did he wait for them to come? Maybe he should have davened immediately. Said, they don't really understand, they don't appreciate, they were emotional, they were caught up. For example, with a golden calf, Moshe davened first. He didn't wait until they approached him. He came down, he rebuked the people, destroyed the golden calf, and immediately went to daven to Hashem. Immediately. Right? With the story of the spies, when Hashem said after the debacle of the spies that he's going to wipe out the nation and start again, Moshe didn't wait for the people to do anything. He immediately went to daven. So what's different about this case?
Do they fear him because of what happened with Korach?
No, because this is 40 years later. So what's unique about this case? Moshe is responding to their approach. He's not taking the initiative of his own accord. He's responding to their approach. So here are people who've done something wrong. They've done something personally wrong against him. They've literally, in a sense, if you want to say, harmed him. They've conceptually assaulted him. So Moshe is the victim of their negativity. And they come to Moshe and they ask Moshe to daven on their behalf. That tells you that they have they've had a change of heart. And they're feeling differently around this. So Rashi says, what this teaches us, Mikan, from this story we learn that if a person is approached by somebody and they ask you forgiveness, you should not, and he uses a very unusual expression, you should not be achzari mi limchol. Achzari means to be cruel. Mi limchol is a little bit ambiguous. It's a little bit ambiguous. Because basically, if you want to take it at face value, what he's telling us is that if a person comes to ask forgiveness, you shouldn't give them a hard time. You should accept it. You should be gracious. You should embrace them because they're trying. They're trying to reconcile. So don't string them along. Don't add salt to the wound. If somebody comes over and they ask you and they feel really terrible, accept them. So don't be achzari. Don't be cruel. Milim chol. Direct translation, from forgiving. So in other words, you'd read this and you'd think basically what Rashi is obviously saying is don't be a harsh person who refuses to forgive. That's what it sounds like, right? Don't be achzari, don't be a harsh person. Mi limchol, that will prevent you from forgiving them. Okay? Now, sometimes we have access to different copies of the original writings of Rashi. Obviously, you can imagine what happened. Rashi would write his commentary, he'd distribute it, people would make copies, and occasionally those copies had certain variations from one to the other, and it's difficult to know which is the original, which is the one that was altered. So there's another version of Rashi that says, now this is even more difficult to understand, that you shouldn't be achzari limchol. You should not be cruel to forgive. Which sounds like a complete oxymoron. Surely if you're forgiving, you're not being cruel. So how could he say that you shouldn't be cruel to forgive? Okay, so there's some wordiness about this interpretation that we have to understand, and hopefully we'll have the opportunity still to come back and analyze that, because it's quite a lot that we have to get through. So we'll see. But the simplest headline message of what Rashi is telling us is that this is the story in the Torah that teaches us that after somebody has wronged a person and then they make an approach to try and reconcile and they're asking for forgiveness, you should not be that person who says, forget about it. I'm not doing this. I'm not forgiving you. If somebody makes the approach, be gracious, accept it, right? Here is the source. Now, we know that at this point we are in the fourth book of the Torah, and we are over halfway through the fourth book of the Torah. So we've had a lot of stories that the Torah has told us by this point. Rashi is saying this is the story that teaches us about the importance of forgiveness and being gracious when it comes to forgiving people. We have to ask ourselves, in the whole of the Torah until now, do we not have any other precedent of somebody who was easy to forgive? No precedent. So let's go back. We'll find a story that some of the other commentators point out is, in fact, the story that teaches us that this is how you're supposed to forgive. In fact, that includes the Rambam, and the reason that that's important is because the Rambam includes the other example, not this example we're looking at, includes the earlier example when he gives us the rules of forgiveness. Now remember, the Rambam talks about halacha, how you're supposed to apply Judaism in practice, and so it's interesting that he uses an earlier example to illustrate the point. So what's the earlier example? Most likely you wouldn't have thought of it. The earlier example is that there was a famine in the land of Canaan, and Abraham and Sarah had to go find somewhere where they could live, where there was at least enough food to be able to get by for the period of time until things would recover in Canaan. This is not the first story. The first story is the most famous story. They go down to Egypt. This is the second, less famous story, where they go to a place called Gerar. Gerar is Philistine territory. Philistine is one of the most ancient nations that come up again and again and again in the Torah. And the king of the Philistines at that point is a man called Avimelech. So because Abraham and Sarah have experience from when they went down to Egypt, where they were afraid that if the king would know that Sarah is the wife, then he would have killed Abraham in order to take Sarah as his wife or his concubine or whatever it was. So they used the ruse, that were brother and sister. So they figured they're going to do the same thing again to Avimelech in Gerar, because who knows what's going to happen. So Avimelech, like Pharaoh before him, takes Sarah captive. Okay, because he figures if she's not a married woman, he's taking her. No sooner does that happen, his entire household begins to suffer from an excruciating condition, where basically none of their systems work properly. So they can't go to the bathroom, and everybody's now getting, as you can well imagine, highly uncomfortable because nothing's working. So Avimelech doesn't understand what the problem is, and then he has a dream. And in the dream, Hashem says to Avimelech, you have to realize this has come onto your family because you took Sarah, and she's a married woman, and she's married to Abraham, and as a result, you have to return her to her husband. He is a man of God. He'll know that you haven't touched her, and he'll pray for you in order to heal. And Avimelech says in this conversation, I don't know any different. I took a woman, of course, but I didn't take a married woman. In my assessment, she wasn't a married woman, and so it's inappropriate that I should have to suffer like this. And Hashem says to Avimelech, I know that your intentions were not as malicious as that. I mean, to say that they were pure intentions is a bit of a stretch. You don't just go like abducting women because they enter your country. But the fact is they were not as malicious as that. It wasn't adultery. So, therefore, you got to wait out. Go speak to Avraham, and he'll sort things out. So Avimelech goes to Avraham, and he says, I'm terribly sorry, misunderstanding. Have your wife. All is good in the world. Please daven for me. And Avraham does. And what happens when Avraham davens for Avimelech? Immediately, so firstly, Avraham davens immediately. Secondly, everybody is cured immediately. So surely, we have a far earlier story in the Torah that illustrates to us that when somebody approaches you and asks you for forgiveness, you're supposed to forgive them without hesitation. And don't be harsh and don't be cruel, as we've seen over here. So why does Rashi not comment all the way back in the first book of the Torah, where we have a great example of this graciousness and this willingness to be able to forgive? Why doesn't Rashi comment there and instead waits until our story with Moshe and the people with the snakes? And not only does he wait till our story, but he adds a key word. He says, mi kan. This is the illustration. This is the source of how you're supposed to be able to forgive people. What's missing in the story with Avraham? Okay, that's going to be our big question that we have to try and analyze. So the first thing that might cross your mind is you might say, where in that story did Avimelech ask for forgiveness? In fact, to the contrary, it actually doesn't sound like a request for forgiveness. Actually, it sounds almost like an accusation. Because what happens? Avimelech comes to Avram the next day, and he says to him, you didn't tell me this is your wife. As if to say, what do you expect from me? We're just barbarians over here. Like, what do you expect of us? You bring a beautiful woman into the country. What do you think's going to happen? So the fact that I abducted her is essentially your fault because you did not declare your relationship. Does that sound like an apology? That's the short skirt argument. She was asking for it. Like, what kind of an argument is that? What kind of a request for forgiveness is that? So perhaps that's the reason that Rashi does not want to use that example to illustrate to us that you should be forgiving when somebody asks for forgiveness, because there's no indicator that anybody asked for forgiveness. Right? Does that make sense to you? Does that make sense? Not at all. It doesn't make sense at all. Think about it. If we have an example where somebody did not ask forgiveness, and yet Abraham was so gracious that he immediately davened for healing, surely we could logically deduce from that if a person does not ask you forgiveness and still you forgive them, how much more so then if somebody does ask forgiveness, you should forgive them? In other words, that story of Avram and Avimelech sounds like the best illustration of the fact that you should forgive somebody when they need forgiveness. Not when they ask forgiveness, when they need forgiveness. And if you're supposed to follow Avram's example and forgive them even before they ask you for forgiveness, and maybe even when they don't ask, maybe when they're still excusing themselves and rationalizing, and maybe even gaslighting you, then for sure we can appreciate that you should that you should forgive somebody graciously when they feel humble and when they come knocking on the door and they say, I did a terrible thing and please forgive me. So that does not answer our question. We're back to square one. Why is it that Rashi is waiting until our story, which is the story with the snakes and the people, and that's where we're going to learn about the power of, or the responsibility of, forgiveness? Okay? Interesting question. The other thing that you might want to answer is, who says Abraham forgave him? The Torah doesn't tell us that.
Just
basically, he davened for him. He davened for him. And just because somebody davens for somebody else, even to protect them from something unfortunate that's happened to them, even to remove a punishment from them, that doesn't mean that I feel okay with what they did. So how do I know that davening for somebody equates to forgiving them? I'll give you an example, right? Here's an example we could relate to. Imagine that there's an individual you've had a fallout with them, God forbid. And then they get sick. And they make a Tehillim group, as is customary, right? The local custom now is that if somebody's sick, you have to have a Tehillim group. If you don't have a Tehillim group, are you even davening for them? So they make a Tehillim group. And you feel bad because this person is not well. So you join the Tehillim group. And every few hours you're posting over there, Tehillim number, whatever, that you're saying on their behalf. Does that mean they should interpret now that you've forgiven them? What's the one got to do with the other? It's very possible to daven for a person because it's the correct thing to do when they're going through a tough time, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you've addressed your hurt. So how do we know, considering that Avimelech does not ask for forgiveness, and considering that Avram's response is to daven, without the Torah saying anything about forgiving, how do we actually know that he forgave? And maybe that's why we have to wait until our story, Because in our story, we're going to see an example of forgiving people when and soon after, without hesitation and without harshness and without being cynical about it. Straight away to forgive. Maybe you have to wait for our story. The only thing is what? In our story, it also does not say Moshe forgave them. In our story, all it says is, what does it say?
I'm looking for it.
He davened. That's also the same words. Almost identical to the story of Avraham. By Avraham it says that Avraham davened for Avimelech and his family. And over here it says that Moshe davened to Hashem. So if your argument is that we don't know whether or not Avraham forgave the people just because he davened for them, you can have the same question over here. In our case, how do you know that Moshe forgave the people just because he davened for them? So therefore, we are back to square one, which is, we apparently have a very powerful story much earlier in the Torah about forgiveness and about being gracious and about not holding a grudge and about not being difficult and not being harsh in a very personal story. Think about it. In the Avimelech story, the guy took Abraham's wife. I mean, how much more personal could you get? He took his wife. Here, the people spoke against Moshe. I'm sorry to say, it's not the first time in Moshe's career that such a thing has happened. And while it might be hurtful, and it's certainly inappropriate, it's not nearly as criminal as taking the guy's wife. So from the story of Abraham davening for Avimelech, apparently we cannot learn the power of forgiveness or the responsibility of being gracious when we forgive, even though that is such a deeply personal story. And we have to wait until this story, which is the story of an affront against his leadership, a wobble because there they are in the desert and they don't have water or whatever the particular issues were that they were facing, where you can kind of justify why everybody's all worked up. Why is that a more compelling story of forgiveness than the story of a person who's willing to daven for the individual who stole his wife? Unless, of course, forgiveness is not as black and white as we think. And maybe it's more nuanced and more layered than we imagine. And that, please God, is what we'll analyze tomorrow. What does real forgiveness look like?